This morning I would like to begin by talking about something that each of us leave behind. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's invisible, and that is fingerprints. What do we know about fingerprints? We know that everybody's fingerprints are unique and different from someone else. Even if you have an identical twin or triplet or whatever, the fingerprints are still different, which is mind-boggling to me when you think that there's over 7 billion people on the earth as of this one moment, and how many have come before us. Everyone has their unique fingerprints. And these fingerprints show what each of us have touched or come in contact with us with. And again, sometimes they're visible. You know, if this were dusty and dirty up here, which it's not, I could touch it and see my fingerprints. I can't now because it is clean. So again, sometimes visible, sometimes not. But do we ever think that God also leaves fingerprints? Maybe not material, physical ones like we do, but we can see his presence through a variety of different things. And we can see his fingerprints much better through faith. The message today, I hope, will help you to be on the lookout in identifying God's fingerprints in the things that happen in our lives. Oftentimes, in retrospect, we see this more when we are times we're unaware of God's presence in our lives, and later on we look and, oh, there was a fingerprint of God, or there was something that happened, and usually it happens that way. But even as Christians, oftentimes it's just human nature. Something bad happens in our lives and we get wrapped up in the moment. We don't always see the fingerprint at that time. But again, in hindsight, with the glasses of faith, you can call it, we can see those fingerprints show up. Times when we thought God was absent and he was just letting me go through this trial by myself, really wasn't the case, because his fingerprints were there all along. This morning we're going to continue in the book of Zechariah, chapter 6. Some challenging prophecies here. If you've ever tried to read the Bible through the whole way, you might have read this and thought, okay, what in the world's going on here? It doesn't make a lot of sense to 21st century Americans unless you have some of that background, which I want to provide to you before we make it to the scripture this morning. And through history, though, that is a really significant way that we can see God's fingerprints in what happens here. And then it prepares our minds. It trains us to be, again, looking for fingerprints of God in our lives. And the thing is, once you understand what I'm going to share with you this morning, I think it prepares you better to understand not just Zechariah, but the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and Isaiah and Zephaniah, and Haggai, and Habakkuk, and Daniel, and probably some others too, because they were all around this time in history. So, very simple timeline here, okay? If you would start at one end at 1900 BC, and we're rounding, because you get so old it's hard to get exact dates. 1900 BC was a long time ago. So anyway, you had Babylon. They were a country, and they were starting to expand. They're gobbling up territories. They'd invade this country, defeat them, take their land, bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's 1900 BC. Again, very simple and basic. And the thing about Babylon, we have to start there. It is so important for the Christian to understand Babylon, because it is all throughout the Bible, and if you read to the end of the Bible, it's going to show up again, events that haven't happened yet. So very significant to understand. And Babylon has always stood, metaphorically speaking, as opposition to God. So that's one thing we should know. So from 1900, fast forward 1,200 years. Not that nothing happened in that time, but for our purposes today, about 700 BC. Okay, a guy named Isaiah. He wrote a very large book in the Bible, 66 chapters. God gives him a prophecy many prophecies, but one in particular, he told Isaiah, a very specific man named Cyrus is going to defeat the Babylonian Empire. And just think, we start with Babylon. By that time, they've been in power for 1,200 years. That's a long time for an empire to reign. And God's telling Isaiah, this one guy's going to defeat them at some point in the future. Okay, so that's that. Brought us up to 700. Move up almost 100 years, 607 BC. This is when Babylon's still in power. They came into Jerusalem and they destroyed everything, took a lot of people captive, which is what I've been talking about for the first 5 chapters of Zechariah. They ended up coming back from Babylon, but that started to happen around 607 BC. Then you have 539 BC. Okay, so these are getting a little closer together here. That same Cyrus, in the meantime, he's born, he rises to power, and he ends up conquering the Babylonian Empire, like God told Isaiah. This man by name would do this, and by 539 BC, it happened. And very significant prophecy, by the way. And again, by that time, he defeated Babylonian Empire that was in power for almost 1,400 years. Again, very big. Cyrus, for whatever reason, he released the Jews. He says, okay, you guys can go back home. Don't need you here anymore. So you see how this worked God's plan out, actually, allowing them to go back to their homeland. So I don't expect everybody, again, to remember all the dates or anything. I had to, research it and all that. And it's nothing that you can't find in a standard, Christian church history book. But what I want to focus on is that area between 700 BC and 539 BC, less than 200-year period. Like I said, God gave Isaiah this prophecy about the exact man who was going to defeat the Babylonians before he was born, and he gave Isaiah the prophecy before the Jews were even taken captive. To me, that boggles my mind. So when people question God during dark times in their lives, and I'm sure the Jewish people who were taken to Babylon forcibly, they probably thought, God, where are you in all this? Well, guess what? He already knows the guy that's going to bring you guys back even before it starts. When the Jews were praying for that, I'm sure that it didn't even cross their mind, because again, we oftentimes get so focused on what's going on at the time. But the important thing is God is so much bigger than any of these circumstances that happen to us. And the Bible tells us more about how this happened, how they were released in Zechariah chapter 6, where he records a couple more visions that we'll get to the Bible now. And if you're following in your Pew Bible, you'll find it on page 670. It is chapter 6, not a very long chapter. As you can see, 15 short verses, so we'll read those at this time. I looked up again, and there before me were 4 chariots coming out from between 2 mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the fourth dappled, all of them powerful. I asked the angel who was speaking to me, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel answered me, "These are the 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. The one with the black horses is going toward the north country, the one with the white horses toward the west, and the one with the dappled horses toward the south." When the powerful horses went out, they were straining to go throughout the earth. And he said, "Go throughout the earth," so they went throughout the earth. Then he called to me, "Look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north." The word of the Lord came to me, "Take silver and gold from the exiles Heldai, Tobijah, and Judea, who have arrived from Babylon. Go the same day to the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. Take the silver and gold and make a crown, and set it on the head of the high priest, Joshua, son of Jehozadak. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here is the man whose name is the branch, and he will branch out from his place and build the temple of the Lord. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed with majesty, and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne, and there will be harmony between the two. The crown will be given to Heldai, Tobijah, Jedaiah, and Hen, son of Zephaniah, as a memorial in the temple of the Lord. Those who are far away will come and help to build the temple of the Lord, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. This will happen if you diligently obey the Lord your God. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Again, might not be very clear right now, but we'll work our way through this. The vision of the horses that go out into the world shows how God handled these situations. The Babylonian kingdom was the strongest, the biggest, the longest lasting empire to grace the face of the earth up to that point in history. And even that was no match for God's horses. The history books don't tell you what the Bible does about how the fall of Babylon was an exact result because of an act of God. In October of 539 BC, Cyrus, the guy that Isaiah mentioned by name almost 200 years before, he was bent on destroying Babylon, and he knew that they were going to be celebrating a feast around in October of that year, not suspecting an attack at all. So what he did, the river Euphrates runs by the area where they were going to attack, and this river at that time of the year was a significant body of water. Only the best swimmers could make it across alive. Many didn't make it alive. So what Cyrus did is he stationed his men north, because the water flows to the south, and he had them divert water out of the river. So downstream, that lowered the water to only about waist deep, making it much easier for an army to pass across the river. And he did that. It all worked out for them anyway, and that spelled the end of the great Babylonian kingdom. They were attacked without knowing, and one thing led to another. Again, it all happened because of God's horses, though. Metaphorically speaking, horses. We don't know if they were physical, actual ones. But no matter how strong and powerful man ever becomes, kingdoms rise and fall because of God. And we just wonder then, how much bigger is God than the things that we face? Again, we get so focused on things, it looks like what I'm dealing with now is so big. Well, anything that we're dealing with doesn't even compare to the rise and fall of a whole nation. Yet we lose sight, and we oftentimes get discouraged. And it's just sometimes difficult to understand and wrap our minds around how God allows evil regimes to be in power. The short answer to that is sometimes it allows his plan to be brought about in a certain way. A quick example of this, the German Holocaust, early 20th century. It was terrible. We all know all the things that happened, Hitler's concentration camps, gas chambers, those kind of things. But it is very unlikely that the nation of Israel would exist today if not for that Holocaust, because everyone then rallied behind Israel after Hitler was defeated. And the fact is, the Bible tells us Israel has to exist for certain events in the future in the Bible to play out. Many of which haven't even played out yet. So God took something terrible in the Holocaust. He didn't cause it, but he took it and he made it fit into his plan for the betterment of the world in the long run. And maybe there's something bad or terrible in your life that you're dealing with now. Who knows how it may turn out in the end? I can't promise it's going to turn out well like it has so far for Israel, but maybe it will, and maybe one day you'll see those fingerprints and you'll remember back and say, oh yeah, God did have a purpose for this. Maybe I lost a job, but maybe it wasn't the right job for me, and now I'm much happier in this new job because something bad happened to me, and now God made something good out of it. Well, in chapter 6 of Zechariah, the vision talks about these white and black horses. Some of them travel north and south, and it says how my spirit is at rest in the north country. Well, when Cyrus defeated the Babylonians, he's basically saying God's spirit was finally at rest in that certain circumstance because, again, his people were finally released to go back to their home country and to rebuild the temple, to worship God in a better way. That was how we see the white horse of victory, also at the expense of the black horse of death. Victory doesn't really come without death in the Bible, and that's because man is sinful, and that's basically the way of the world. The angel is reminding God's people God's always in control, so it would be a good thing to follow God's lead. Now that they are released from captivity, go and rebuild that temple and recommit yourself to the proper worship of God. And that involves living righteous and holy lives. The horses are this vision given to Zechariah, and it's followed by a message from God. It sort of makes sense of it. We have to make sense of this next scene now, where we have these three men, and they go to this guy's house, and they put a crown on this guy named Joshua. What in the world's going on here? Well, if you notice in the Bible, when it says the word branch, in verse 12, it's capitalized there, and that's intentional. That's because the translators know that they're talking about Jesus there in the Old Testament. So it's a foretelling of Jesus. So this priest Joshua is the center of this ceremony that's nothing more than a symbolic representation of Christ. Joshua's not becoming a king, actually. God says, I want you to do this so that your people see that I have a plan, and one day I'm going to raise up a king. We know from looking back from the other direction that this will be Jesus. And it's a clear foretelling of Jesus, who qualifies as a priest. Joshua was a priest. Now God's making him a king as well. And the thing is, in the Bible, 99 times out of 100, and say that generally, you're one or the other. You're a priest or you're a leader, a king, for instance. Very few exceptions are both. Jesus is one such exception here, and that is what they are trying to represent in this crowning of Joshua. The point I'm trying to get across here is that the more you know about these things that surround the Bible, the more you are training yourself to see God's fingerprints in events that happened back then and events that are continuing to happen now, just like Cyrus and all these things that I've already mentioned. I don't need to repeat all that now, but I ask, has it ever happened to you? Has it ever happened to you where you have seen things happen in your life? Like I said, something maybe bad happens or something that you really hoped wouldn't happen, but then in hindsight, you realize that it was done for a better purpose that I wouldn't have chosen in the time and the place. Just reminds me the times that I see this happening, that God is at work in my life, even when I'm not noticing it at the time. There may be days when it doesn't seem like God is in control. Things are just going out of control in your life. But, for instance, the same thing happened with the Jews back in 700 BC. They couldn't have fathomed how God could have used this captivity of them to work out the liberation of his people and actually draw them even closer to them by building yet another temple to worship him. Not only did God have a plan for the release of the Jews, but I think what's even harder to wrap our minds around is that God had a plan for the captivity of the Jews as well. And we don't see it in Zechariah, but again, we can't just pull this one book out of the Bible. Because if they had not been taken captive, guess what wouldn't have happened? Guys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would never have been in the fiery furnace and never would have been delivered from that. We never would have had Daniel in the lion's den, the angel of the Lord would have closed the mouth of the lions. All these other things would have happened. The great King Nebuchadnezzar never would have been in a position to acknowledge God as the king of the world if the Jews had not been taken captive in the first place. Point is, God does have a plan and a purpose. I can't say it's for every specific person, because if somebody's on their deathbed, can you really say God has much of a purpose for that? Maybe, maybe not. That's another issue. But God raises up kingdoms and he tears them down in accordance with his plan. And we can see how God can easily make something good out of something bad. And for me, I know it is a big dose of humility every time that I realize that God has done something that was engineered for a long time before I was even aware. And now I see that everything worked out up to this point. And it's no coincidence that that vision of the horses was followed by Joshua being crowned king, which is, as I mentioned, a picture of Jesus' crowning as king of the world too. Again, going from 1900 BC to 700 and 539, what does all that mean for us? Well, the same God who builds and destroys kingdoms also cares for us individually. He cared about every single Jewish person that he brought back from captivity, for one thing. And how many devout Jewish believers were taken away from their homeland in the captivity and died there? But more good would come out of that. And that's the one thing. If something bad does happen, I hope that and I pray that if something good doesn't happen to me, maybe something good will happen for somebody else through something that happened in my circumstance. I don't know what everybody here is dealing with, but I do know that God has a plan that may or may not involve fixing that situation in the immediate future. But one day, it is my prayer that you'll be able to look back on that difficult trial or struggle and see the fingerprints of God there and see how things were being worked out when we had no idea. As a result, we just hope that our faith gets stronger. Again, there's the old saying, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and there's a lot of truth in that. Prepares us for the next struggle. And the more struggles that we make it through, we are more prepared to come alongside a brother or sister in the faith who's dealing with something. And then we can give them the encouragement as well, and that they can also look for the fingerprints of God in the situations that they are dealing with. And it just perpetuates the cycle, and then they are prepared to come alongside somebody else. And you have this multiplication effect. I do know that God wants you to trust him through the good times and the bad. Times when you think he has forgotten you. You don't see him there. You might not even feel him there. But hopefully later you'll see that his fingerprints prove that he was there all along the way, just like he was for the Jewish people and millions, literally millions of Christian believers in the years since then. Let's now close with a word of prayer.